For just $40, she agreed to wreck a blind date, but instead of walking away, the wealthy CEO found himself falling for her. Before we dive into the story, share in the comments which city you're watching from. And when it's over, don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10. Let's begin. When my best friend Mia called me that Saturday afternoon, I should have known trouble was waiting. She was whispering in that guilty voice she always used when asking for something she knew I would hate. "Harper," she said, "I need you to do me a favor, please." I was already shaking my head. Even though she couldn't see me, Mia's parents had set her up on a blind date with some so-called perfect man, someone they swore would change her life. The problem was Mia already had a boyfriend, a serious one, but she couldn't say no to her parents without causing another war at home. So instead, she asked me to do the dirty work for her. "Just meet him," she begged. "Make a scene, embarrass him, say whatever comes to your mind so he'll run off and never call again. You're the only one who can pull this off." I told her she was insane. But by 7 o'clock, I found myself walking into a little Italian place downtown, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt on purpose. If this guy thought he was meeting some sweet, obedient girl who would fit the perfect daughter-in-law fantasy, he was about to have the worst night of his life. The hostess led me to a corner table where he was already waiting. He stood up politely, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair pushed back like he had walked straight out of a magazine. He gave me a smile that seemed too confident, like he had practiced it in the mirror. "You must be Mia," he said warmly. I smirked and sat down without shaking his hand. "Actually, I'm Harper. Mia couldn't make it. But don't worry. I promised her I'd take good care of you." His eyebrows lifted, but he didn't look offended. Most men would have left right there. That would have made my job easier. Instead, he sat back down, intrigued. I pulled the menu open dramatically and began what I thought would be my greatest performance. I started telling him every embarrassing story I could invent. How I once got arrested for stealing a shopping cart as a dare, how I kept pet snakes in my bathtub, how I believed in aliens and had written to the president about it. Each ridiculous detail was meant to scare him off, to make him realize Mia was not the girl he wanted. But the strangest thing happened. He didn't run. He laughed. Not a fake laugh either, but a genuine one, like I had just told him the most refreshing thing he had heard in years. He leaned in, asking questions, his eyes gleaming with interest. "So you wrote to the president?" Did he answer? I rolled my eyes and kept pushing, turning every moment into a joke. I even ordered the most expensive bottle of wine just to see if he would flinch. Instead, he poured me a glass himself, saying, "If you're going to drink it, then so will I." I couldn't understand him. Most men in this city would have bolted before dessert, but he seemed more entertained with every outrageous thing I said. It annoyed me. It also made me nervous. By the time the bill came, $40 for 2 plates of pasta and the wine he insisted on paying for, I was convinced I had failed Mia completely. On the walk out, I gave him one last warning. "You really don't want to see me again. I'm a disaster." He just smiled calmly, holding the door open. That's the most fun I've had in years. I should have ended it there. I should have left him behind and forgotten his name. But as I walked home that night, still replaying his laugh in my head, I had no idea that this man, this Dylan, was about to walk straight back into my life, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, I promised myself I would erase the memory of that date from my head. I woke up, tied my apron, and headed to the little cafe where I worked. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the rent and kept me close to the dream I still carried quietly in my chest, to one day run a restaurant of my own, something my father had once believed in for me before life stole him away too soon. The cafe was crowded as usual, full of regulars who wanted their coffee strong and their sandwiches cheap. I balanced trays, wiped tables, and tried to ignore the ache in my legs from working double shifts. To me, it was just another day, until the bell above the door rang and I looked up. He was standing there. Dylan. The man from last night. The man I had sworn I would never see again. He didn't look out of place in his crisp shirt and polished shoes, though everyone else in the cafe wore hoodies or work boots. He spotted me instantly, his smile spreading as if he had been waiting for this very moment. I froze, nearly dropping the tray in my hands. He walked up to the counter with a confidence that irritated me, ordered lunch like he was just another customer, and then leaned casually on the counter where I stood. So Harper, do you always ruin dates for sport? Or was I just lucky? His voice was calm, teasing, but his eyes were fixed on me with a sharpness that made my stomach twist. I glared at him, refusing to play along. Shouldn't you be nursing your ego somewhere after last night? On the contrary, he said smoothly. I came back because I wanted to see if you'd be as entertaining sober as you were over a $40 bottle of wine. I wanted to roll my eyes to dismiss him, but a part of me hated how easily he had gotten under my skin. He wasn't supposed to show up. He wasn't supposed to remember me. And yet here he was, sitting at a corner table, refusing to disappear. When I brought him his food, he started asking questions. Not the polite kind people ask to fill silence, but ones that made it clear he was actually paying attention. How long have you worked here? Do you like it? Do you ever plan on doing something else? I kept my answers short, hoping to bore him into leaving, but he only smiled wider. Then, out of nowhere, one of the waitresses whispered in my ear. Do you know who that is? Dylan Carter. His family owns Carter Enterprises. They're everywhere. Real estate, hotels, shipping, you name it. He's basically royalty in this city. My heart skipped. Suddenly, my mind flashed back to last night, to the insults I had thrown at him. Calling him a spoiled major, mocking him for being rich, making fun of men who never worked a day in their lives. I had thought he was just some arrogant stranger. Now I realized I had been insulting one of the heirs to a fortune that made my world look like dust in comparison. I returned to his table, my face burning. He looked at me knowingly, as if he had been waiting for me to figure it out. So, he said, stirring his coffee lazily, do you still think I'm just a greedy major? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in a long time, I felt cornered, exposed. The man I had tried to chase away with jokes and chaos was not only still here. He was someone whose name carried more weight than I could even imagine. And yet, instead of gloating, instead of using that power to humiliate me, Dylan leaned closer, his voice soft but certain. You see, Harper, you judged me before you knew me. But I like that. It means you're not afraid. And I can't stop thinking about what else you might say if I give you another chance. I told myself I didn't care, that I wouldn't let someone like him crawl into my life. But as he sat there, smiling as though he had already won, a question echoed in my head, louder than reason. Why had a man who could have anyone, who lived in a world far above mine, chosen to come back for me? And I knew then, this was only the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. By the end of that week, I was exhausted from fighting with myself. Every morning I told my reflection the same thing. I didn't care about Dylan Carter. I didn't care about his sharp smile, his persistence, or the way he somehow remembered every word I said even when I was trying to push him away. But each time I walked into the cafe, I found myself scanning the doorway as if waiting for him to appear. And when he finally did, on a rainy Thursday, coat dripping and hair tousled from the wind, I realized I had already lost the battle with my own curiosity. He didn't ask this time. He simply ordered a coffee, sat at the counter, and waited until my shift ended. The rain hadn't slowed, and when I stepped outside with my umbrella, he was still there, leaning against the lamppost like he belonged in the storm. Walk with me, he said, not like a request but like something inevitable. I should have said no. Instead, I fell into step beside him. The city looked different in the rain, streets blurred with reflections, headlights smearing across wet pavement, umbrellas colliding like strangers in a dance. Dylan didn't talk much at first, which surprised me. He seemed comfortable in the silence, stealing glances at me every now and then as if memorizing the shape of my thoughts. Finally, I broke the quiet. Why do you keep following me around? Don't you have some empire to run? He chuckled softly. You make it sound like I'm chasing you. Maybe I just enjoy being where you are. I shook my head, pulling my coat tighter. You're ridiculous. You don't even know me. That's where you're wrong, he said, and there was something so certain in his tone that it stopped me. I know you're braver than you pretend. I know you use sarcasm like armor because letting someone see the truth scares you. And I know you care more about other people than yourself, even when it hurts. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. No one had ever said something like that to me. Not with such clarity, not with such conviction. I looked away, hoping the rain would hide the heat rising in my cheeks. We ended up near my apartment, A small third-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a heater that groaned in protest every winter. I should have said goodbye at the door, but instead I found myself unlocking it and letting him in, my heart thudding like it was betraying me. The room smelled faintly of garlic and old wood, a scent that always reminded me of my father's food truck. The truck had been his pride, parked on the same corner for 15 years, serving tacos and empanadas that kept half the neighborhood alive. When he died, the truck was sold, and I was left with nothing but a stack of recipes scribbled in his handwriting. As Dylan looked around my tiny apartment, he didn't sneer the way I feared. He sat on the couch as if it were a throne and asked me to tell him more. I don't know why I did, but the words spilled out. The story of my father, of the nights I fell asleep to the smell of frying onions, of my dream to open a restaurant one day that carried his spirit forward. I told him how impossible it felt, how I could barely afford rent, how no one took a waitress from a poor neighborhood seriously. When I finally stopped, embarrassed by how much I had revealed, Dylan's eyes were steady on me. "You think you're just a girl serving coffee," he said quietly. "But I see someone who has fire in her hands and a vision in her head. That's not ordinary. That's rare." I wanted to laugh it off, to turn his words into a joke, but I couldn't. Because part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me wanted to believe that someone like him, who could have chosen anyone, who lived in a world I'd only glimpsed through magazine covers, saw something in me worth fighting for. The rain hammered harder against the windows, and the silence between us deepened into something fragile and dangerous. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping low. "Let me take you out again. Not a date. Just a walk. The city, your city, through your eyes. Show me the places that built you." I should have said no. I should have remembered every warning bell ringing in my head. But instead I found myself nodding. Because even though every instinct screamed that I didn't belong in his world, some stubborn part of me wanted to show him mine. And as he left that night, pausing at the door with one last lingering look, I felt the air shift around me. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was the beginning of something that could burn everything I knew to the ground. I told myself that night in the rain was just a moment, one that would fade with the weather. But it didn't. Dylan kept showing up, sometimes at the cafe, sometimes waiting outside after my shift, always patient, always disarming me with that maddening calm. I tried to remind myself who he was. An heir to wealth, a man with choices far beyond the reach of someone like me. And yet, each time we spoke, it felt less like he was intruding on my life, and more like he was weaving himself into it. The breaking point came a week later. He asked me to meet him after work, and though I intended to say no, I found myself agreeing. We walked again, no destination in mind, just the rhythm of our footsteps through streets that smelled of rain and fried food. He asked me about my favorite places, my father's recipes, the flavors I remembered most. I answered cautiously at first, but the more I spoke, the more he listened, not politely but intently, like every word was something he wanted to keep. Finally, as we sat beneath the awning of an old bookstore to escape a drizzle, he turned to me with an expression that unsettled me more than any teasing smile could. "Harper," he said, his voice steady, "you should have a restaurant of your own. Not someday. Not in the abstract. Now." I laughed, shaking my head. "You don't just snap your fingers and open a restaurant. Do you know how much it costs? How many hoops there are to jump through? It's not a dream for someone like me. It's a fantasy." But Dylan didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his eyes unwavering. "I'm serious. I'll back you. Whatever it takes, location, equipment, staff. I'll be your investor. You bring the food. I'll bring the capital. Together, we'll build something that carries your father's flame forward." His words froze me. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. I stared at him, stunned, and then the heat of anger flushed through me. "Investor," I spat, standing abruptly. "Is that what this is about? You think you can just buy my dream because you're rich? Throw some money at me like charity and pat yourself on the back?" Dylan stood too, hands raised in surrender. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant," I snapped. "Do you know how insulting that is? I've scraped for every dollar, worked double shifts, given up nights of sleep just to survive. And you stand there with your perfect coat and your perfect life, thinking you can swoop in and save me. I don't need your arms. I'm not some project for you to fix." For the first time, his expression cracked. He looked at me not with amusement or certainty, but with something quieter. Hurt maybe. Or regret. Harper, he said softly, I wasn't offering because I think you're weak. I was offering because I believe in you more than you believe in yourself. I couldn't answer. My chest was too tight, my pride burning too hot. I turned away muttering, I don't need your help, before storming off into the rain. Back in my apartment that night, I slammed the door and tried to convince myself I had done the right thing. Pride was all I had left. Taking his money, his influence, it would have made me feel like I was nothing but another one of his luxuries, something he could discard when he got bored. But as I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the faded postcard pinned to the wall, my anger began to crumble. The postcard was from my father's old truck. The colors were washed out, but the words were still clear. Food made with fire, for people made of dreams. He had written those words himself, painted them in shaky letters across the side of the truck, and I had copied them on the postcard when I was 12. For years it had been my compass. And now, staring at it, I wondered if I had let my pride blind me to something my father would have called a chance. Mia stopped by later that night, finding me sulking with cold tea. When I told her what had happened, she didn't scold me or comfort me. She just pulled the postcard from the wall, held it up and said, Harper, maybe your father didn't raise you to reject the people who want to stand beside you. Maybe he raised you to be brave enough to try. Her words lodged in my chest, uncomfortable and undeniable. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. My dream wasn't meant to stay on scraps of paper forever. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't meant to fight alone. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, torn between pride and possibility. Dylan's face kept flashing in my mind, not smug this time but earnest. And the question I had refused to ask myself finally broke through. What if saying no meant losing the only chance I'd ever have to make my dream real? And by the time I decided to give him an answer, it would lead me to a night of chaos, laughter and fire. The night Harper's flame was born. When I finally called Dylan, my voice was steadier than I felt. I told him I wasn't saying yes to him, not to his money, not to whatever world he came from. I was saying yes to the dream that had been waiting inside me since I was a girl, standing barefoot beside my father's food truck with the smell of grilled peppers in the air. He didn't argue. He didn't gloat. He simply said, then let's start. The weeks that followed blurred into a storm of decisions. Dylan handled paperwork and negotiations with a speed that terrified me. Leases, permits, vendors, all the things I didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, I spent nights sketching menus, testing recipes in my tiny kitchen, and calling Mia at 3 in the morning when the fear was louder than the excitement. Each time I doubted myself, Dylan would quietly push me forward, reminding me that this was mine, not his. I didn't want to believe him, but a part of me began to. When the sign went up, Harper's Flame in bold red letters, I nearly cried right there on the sidewalk. The building wasn't fancy. The tables were secondhand, the paint still smelled sharp, and the kitchen was smaller than my father's truck had been. But it was real. My name was on the door. My father's fire was alive again. The opening night was supposed to be perfect. I had imagined it so many times. Music drifting softly, customers savoring every bite, laughter filling the air like a blessing. Instead, it was chaos. The first batch of bread burned to black crusts. The band we hired played 3 songs at once, each louder than the last. One of the waiters slipped carrying a tray of soup, splattering it across a woman's sequin dress. I was running between the kitchen and the dining room, sweat sticking my hair to my neck, convinced the whole night was a disaster. But then something unexpected happened. People didn't leave. They laughed. They clapped when the waiter stood up again, bowing dramatically with soup dripping from his apron. They hummed along with the off-key saxophone. They ate the food, even the dishes that came out too salty or too late. And instead of complaining, they asked for seconds. Dylan sat at a corner table, watching it all with that quiet smile of his. And when our eyes met, he mouthed, "This is you." At one point, I ducked into the kitchen, ready to collapse, and found Mia waiting with a glass of water. "Look around, Harper," she said. "They're not here for perfection. They're here for you." And she was right. When I stepped back into the dining room, I saw it clearly. People weren't just eating. They were part of something alive, something messy and warm and real. My father's words came back to me. Food made with fire, for people made of dreams. That night, Harper's flame wasn't flawless, but it was honest. And the customers felt it. By closing time, the tables were littered with empty plates. The band had finally found their rhythm, and strangers were hugging us goodnight like old friends. I stood by the door, exhausted but trembling with something I hadn't felt in years: hope. After the last guest left, Dylan walked into the kitchen where I was wiping down counters with shaky hands. He leaned against the doorway, his voice low but sure. "You thought tonight was a disaster. But what I saw was a beginning. And beginnings are always messy." I stared at him, too tired to argue, too full of gratitude to admit it. "I don't know how to thank you," I whispered. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just keep cooking. The rest will follow." I wanted to believe that was true, that everything from here would be laughter and light. But even as I locked the door that night, the air still humming with smoke and music, a shadow flickered in the back of my mind. Success has a way of drawing enemies even when you least expect it. And I had no idea that soon Harper's flame would face a scandal that could burn everything to ashes, along with the fragile trust between Dylan and me. For weeks after opening night, Harper's flame grew like a fire that refused to be tamed. Word spread faster than I could have imagined. Bloggers wrote about us, customers lined up outside the door, and even critics who usually sneered at small neighborhood joints began showing up with pens poised and appetites ready. I should have been happy, maybe even proud, but instead I lived in a constant blur of exhaustion. I woke up at dawn, collapsed long past midnight, and carried the weight of every plate and every expectation on my shoulders. Still, when I saw the tables full and the laughter rising, I told myself it was worth it. Dylan was there almost every evening, not to control, not to boast, but simply to sit quietly in the corner, watching me work as if I was the only thing in the room that mattered. Sometimes I caught his eyes, steady and warm, and for a flicker of a second, I wondered if this was more than business. I tried to push that thought away. Dreams and millionaires did not belong in the same sentence. Then, on a Friday night when the restaurant was packed, everything shifted. A man at the center table stood abruptly, clutching his stomach. His voice was loud, sharp enough to cut through the music. "This food poisoned me," he shouted, knocking over a glass of wine. His face twisted in mock agony, and within seconds the room was in chaos. Customers whispered, waiters froze, and someone began filming on their phone. I rushed forward, heart racing. "Sir, please, let's step outside." But he pushed me back, glaring. "You served me spoiled meat. This place is a fraud. You're killing people in here." His words spread like fire through the crowd. Some customers left immediately, fear etched on their faces. Others murmured nervously, their faith unraveling with every second. By the time Dylan reached him, trying to calm the situation, 3 more people claimed they felt sick. Too many, too sudden. My gut told me it was staged. But the cameras didn't care about truth. They cared about drama. And within an hour, clips of the poisoning were already online, the headlines brutal. Popular new restaurant accused of food scandal. I barely slept that night. By morning, city inspectors were at our door, demanding records, samples, proof of safety. I handed everything over with trembling hands, knowing we had nothing to hide, but the damage was already done. Crowds thinned, reservations were canceled, and the phone calls that had once brought excitement now carried only threats and demands for refunds. Through it all, Dylan stayed by my side, his voice calm, his presence steady. "We'll fight this," he said. "The truth always wins." But I couldn't bring myself to believe him. I looked at him and saw not reassurance, but the cruel reminder of how far I had climbed, and how far I could fall. The days that followed were worse. Anonymous reviews flooded the internet, each one more vicious than the last, claiming we served rotten food, that our kitchen was infested, that we ignored safety standards. Lies layered on lies, until even I began to doubt myself. Had I been careless? Had my dream been built too quickly, too recklessly? One night, after another wave of cancellations, I sat alone at a darkened table, staring at the empty chairs. Dylan walked in, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "We'll get through this," he whispered. But instead of comfort, his words sent a shiver of doubt through me. Because what if he wasn't here to fight? What if this scandal was his way out, the perfect excuse to step back and let my world crumble while his remained untouched? I hated myself for thinking it. But as I watched him that night, his face shadowed in the dim light, I couldn't stop the fear from creeping in. The same fear that whispered in the dark. Maybe he's already leaving you. Maybe you were just a game to him after all. And as the trial began, and I stood trembling in front of lawyers and inspectors, that fear grew louder. Because silence stretched between us, and Dylan no longer looked like the man who once swore he believed in me. What I didn't know was that behind my back, forces much stronger than us were pulling the strings, and Dylan was already caught in their trap. The weeks after the scandal were a blur of court hearings, lawyers' questions, and the kind of whispers that follow you like shadows no matter where you go. I had always believed the hardest part of building my dream would be the sleepless nights, the sweat, the doubt. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching everything I had built be reduced to a headline and a rumor. Customers disappeared. Vendors stopped returning calls. Even my staff, once full of laughter and loyalty, began to drift away, too frightened to risk their own names tied to mine. Through it all, Dylan was there, at least in body. He sat beside me during hearings, offered his lawyers, and nodded when inspectors questioned me. But he was quiet, too quiet. I searched his eyes for the warmth that had once made me believe I wasn't alone, and instead I found distance. He looked like a man carrying secrets, and I hated myself for wondering if one of those secrets was regret. Then came the night I found out the truth. I was sitting in the restaurant, alone after closing, the air heavy with the smell of bleach and burnt onions. My phone buzzed. Mia. She told me she had overheard something at a gala she'd been forced to attend with her parents. Dylan's parents had been there too, speaking openly with their friends as if the world belonged to them. And in a way it did. They said it was all planned, Harper, Mia whispered, her voice shaking. They paid people to stage the poisoning to smear the restaurant. They wanted Dylan to give up on you, to walk away before his reputation was dragged down with yours. I felt the blood drain from my face. Why would they do that? Because they don't want you, she said simply. They think you're beneath them. They think you'll ruin his future. And they'll do anything to make sure you disappear from his life. I hung up before she could say more. For a long time I just sat there, staring at the dark windows that once reflected a dream and now reflected only ruin. My hands trembled. It all made sense. The sudden silence from Dylan, the way his parents had never once appeared at the restaurant, the rumors that spread too perfectly to be coincidence. I wanted to believe he wasn't part of it. I wanted to believe he was the man who had walked through the rain just to hear me talk about my father's recipes. But doubt pressed against my ribs until I couldn't breathe. When Dylan came by that night, I confronted him. Tell me the truth, I demanded. Did your family do this? He froze, and in that moment, his silence was louder than any confession. He looked down, jaw tight, hands clenched at his sides. Finally he said, they threatened to cut me off, to strip me of everything. If I fought them, if I defended you, they'd ruin me too. His words hit harder than any betrayal. Not because he admitted the truth, but because he had known all along and kept it from me. So you stayed quiet while they destroyed me, I said, my voice shaking. I was trying to protect you, he insisted. If I fought them openly, they would have crushed you harder. I laughed bitterly. They already did. And you let them. The look on his face broke something inside me. He wanted me to understand, to forgive, but I couldn't. Not then. Not with the ruins of my dreams still smoldering around me. When the truth finally came out, when documents surfaced proving the setup, when witnesses admitted they had been paid to lie, it was too late. The damage was done. The city believed what it wanted to believe, and Harper's Flame was no longer the warm, chaotic place it had been on opening night. It was a scandal, a warning, a name whispered with pity. And yet, when Dylan stood before his parents, stripped of his inheritance, his position, his spotless reputation, and chose me anyway, I didn't feel victory. I felt fear. Because loving someone who had given up everything for you meant carrying a weight you weren't sure you could bear. That night, as he walked into the restaurant with nothing left but his name and his love, he whispered, I've lost everything for you, Harper. But the truth is, I didn't lose anything at all. Because you're the only thing I wanted to keep. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But all I could hear was the echo of my father's words. Fire can warm, or it can burn everything it touches. And as I held Dylan's hand in the ruins of my dream, I realized the fire wasn't done burning yet. The fight to save Harper's flame had only just begun. After the truth about Dylan's parents surfaced, it felt like the city owed me an apology it would never give. Yes, the stage scandal was exposed. Yes, the inspectors quietly withdrew their claims, and the health department confirmed we had done nothing wrong. But the damage was already written into people's minds. To most, Harper's Flame was still a place where something had gone terribly wrong. Customers didn't return just because the papers printed corrections. Trust once broken is not rebuilt with a single headline. For days, I walked into the restaurant and felt only the weight of empty chairs. The kitchen echoed with silence where once there had been laughter. My staff stood listless, half believing we were finished. And truthfully, so did I. But Dylan, he refused to let me give in. He had already sacrificed his inheritance, his reputation, even the support of his own family. He had nothing left to prove but one thing, that I wasn't alone. One night, as we sat at the bar of my deserted restaurant, he slid a notebook toward me. Inside were lists, sketches, ideas. "We're going to win them back," he said simply. "Not with advertisements. Not with apologies. With food. With fire. With you." I looked at him, exhausted. "Dylan, no one believes in us anymore. They've moved on." "Then we'll remind them why they came in the first place," he countered. "We'll open the doors free of charge. A night of food, laughter, and truth. Let them see with their own eyes what Harper's Flame really is." The idea terrified me. Give away food when I could barely pay my suppliers? Invite critics and strangers back into the place that had humiliated me? It sounded like madness. But as I stared at him, his conviction steady, I felt something flicker inside me. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe the ghost of my father whispering not to give up. Whatever it was, it pushed me to nod. "One night," I whispered. "One last chance." We worked for days without rest. Dylan called in favors from people I didn't even know he still had. Mia organized volunteers. I scrubbed every corner of the kitchen, rewrote the menu, and cooked until my hands blistered. Word spread quickly. Harper's Flame was hosting a free tasting, open to anyone bold enough to see past the scandal. The night arrived and I could barely breathe as the first guests walked through the door. Then more came. And more. Within an hour, the restaurant was full. Journalists with notebooks, bloggers with cameras, influencers with their perfect smiles, and to my surprise, everyday people from the neighborhood who had once eaten from my father's food truck. They came not for spectacle but for me. I moved through the kitchen like a woman possessed, plating dishes, tasting sauces, sending out food with trembling hands. Dylan worked beside me, his shirt stained, his hair damp with sweat. No longer the untouchable heir but simply a man fighting for something real. At first the room was cautious. People whispered, picked at their plates. But slowly something shifted. Laughter returned. Glasses clinked. Strangers leaned across tables to share bites, to talk about flavors, to ask for seconds. The atmosphere grew warm, alive, exactly as I had once dreamed. Then came the moment I will never forget. An inspector, the same man who had nearly shut us down, stood up in the middle of the dining room. He raised his fork, smiled faintly, and said, "This is the best meal I've had all year." The room erupted in applause. I gripped the counter, tears stinging my eyes, and for the first time in months, I let myself believe again. By the end of the night, we were exhausted but victorious. The journalists had their headlines, the bloggers their photos, the influencers their videos. But what mattered most was the people, the ones who hugged me on the way out, who promised they would be back, who told me they had never doubted the fire in my food. When the doors finally closed, I collapsed into a chair, my apron stained and my hair falling loose. Dylan sat beside me, his hand brushing mine. "You did it," he whispered. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "We did it." For the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel like a cruel trick. It felt possible. But hope has enemies. And as I would soon learn, victory only made us a bigger target. Because just when I thought Harper's Flame was safe, Dylan's parents returned, this time not with whispers and staged scandals, but with weapons far more dangerous. False documents, accusations, and the kind of power that could destroy us for good. And when they stormed into my restaurant with investors watching, I realized the battle for my dream, and for Dylan, was only just beginning. I thought the worst was behind us. After the tasting night, Harper's flame had begun to breathe again. Customers returned, critics softened, and for the first time in months, laughter filled the dining room without the weight of suspicion. Dylan and I worked side by side, exhausted but alive, rebuilding brick by brick what had been torn down. For a moment I let myself believe in stability. For a moment I allowed hope to feel permanent. That illusion shattered the day Dylan's parents walked through the doors of my restaurant. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of day when investors had scheduled a private lunch to discuss expanding Harper's Flame into a second location. I had dressed carefully, my hands still smelling faintly of lemon from the morning prep. The investors were seated, polite and curious, when the doors slammed open and in swept Mr. and Mrs. Carter, perfectly tailored, perfectly venomous. The room froze. Investors shifted in their seats. My staff looked at me with wide eyes, waiting for my cue. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I stood tall. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I said evenly. This is a surprise. Mrs. Carter's voice was sharp enough to slice through glass. Surprise? Hardly. This farce has gone on long enough. She threw a folder onto the table. Documents spilled out, leases, financial records, contracts. Evidence, she announced, that this restaurant is built on fraud. That my son has embezzled company funds to keep this circus alive. Gasps rippled through the room. One investor picked up a paper, scanning it with a frown. Another whispered something to his colleague. My chest tightened. I knew Dylan hadn't taken a cent from them, but the papers looked real. Stamps signed official. Dylan stood, his face pale but resolute. These are lies. Fabrications. You know it and I know it. His father sneered. Do you think these people care about the truth? All they see is risk. And risk kills investments. I wanted to scream, to throw the papers back in their faces, but my voice felt caught in my throat. Around me, I saw the investors' confidence unravel. Months of work, one miraculous night of redemption. All of it dangled on the edge of collapse. And then just as I thought it was over, the door opened again. Mia burst in, her phone clutched in her hand. Wait, she shouted, breathless. Don't sign anything. Don't believe them. She strode forward, her eyes blazing. Because I have proof of what they did. She set her phone on the table and pressed play. The room filled with voices, not ours but theirs. Mr. and Mrs. Carter's, captured in some elegant ballroom, bragging about how they had staged the scandal, paid for the false witnesses, and now prepared their final move to ruin me once and for all. Their voices were clear, their arrogance undeniable. The investors sat frozen, listening. One by one their eyes turned, not to Dylan's parents but to me. And then something extraordinary happened. One of them, a man who had been skeptical all along, stood, pushed the forged documents aside and said calmly, "We will not be manipulated. If anything, this proves the strength of Harper's Flame. If it can survive this storm, it can survive anything. I'm staying." Another investor nodded. Then another. Relief crashed over me so hard my knees nearly gave out. Dylan reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it tightly, his face a mixture of fury and gratitude. Mr. and Mrs. Carter paled, realizing too late that their power had slipped through their fingers. For the first time they looked small, two people desperate to control a son who had already chosen his own path. They left without another word, their silence heavier than their accusations. The room exhaled as the door shut behind them. The investors turned back to me, and one smiled faintly. "If your food has half the fire you've shown today, Harper, then I'd say we're in good hands." I wanted to collapse, to cry, to scream with relief, but I only nodded, my voice steady. "Then let me show you." And yet, even as victory wrapped around me, I knew the battle wasn't over. Because the fight with Dylan's family had cost us more than money or reputation. It had carved scars into us, into me, that no applause could erase. And when Dylan knelt in the kitchen days later, his heart in his eyes and a ring in his hand, I realized the greatest battle of all would be inside me. Whether to trust love enough to say yes. The days after Dylan's parents stormed out of Harper's Flame felt like waking from a nightmare. The investors stayed, the documents were exposed as forgeries, and the story of their conspiracy spread faster than any of their lies had. For the first time, the city was no longer against me, it was on my side. Customers returned in numbers I hadn't dared to imagine, journalists wrote about resilience instead of scandal, and people lined up not just for the food but for the story, for the stubborn flame that refused to die. Yet inside me, doubt still lingered. Each time I saw Dylan beside me, wiping counters, carrying trays, laughing with the staff as if he had been born into this world and not one of power and privilege, I felt both gratitude and fear. He had sacrificed everything. His inheritance, his position, the life his parents had carefully built for him. And all of it for me. Part of me wondered if I could ever live up to that sacrifice, or if one day he would wake up and regret the ashes he had left behind. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, I stayed behind to scrub the kitchen. It was a ritual by then, something that grounded me after the chaos of the day. The smell of roasted garlic still lingered in the air, and the hum of the refrigerators was the only sound. Dylan appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. He watched me for a moment before stepping inside. "You work harder than anyone I've ever met," he said softly. I shrugged, rinsing a pan. "Hard work is the only reason this place is still standing." "No," he said, moving closer. "It's standing because of you. Because you refuse to give up, even when the world does everything it can to break you." His words hit deeper than I wanted to admit. I set the pan aside, drying my hands on my apron. "Dylan, I don't know if I can ever repay you for what you've given up. I don't want to be the reason you lost your future." He shook his head, stepping closer until his presence filled the room. "You still don't see it, do you? I didn't lose anything. I gained everything that matters. For the first time in my life, I'm not living for my parents' approval, or for money, or for a name carved into buildings. I'm living for something real. For you. For us." Before I could answer, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. My heart stopped. The world around me seemed to fade until it was just the glow of the kitchen lights, the smell of garlic, and the man kneeling on the tile floor. He opened the box, revealing a simple ring, elegant but not extravagant, the kind of ring that spoke of promise rather than wealth. "Harper," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I don't want to be your investor. I don't want to be your savior. I just want to be the man who walks beside you, through the chaos, the fire, the laughter, all of it. Will you marry me?" For a long moment I couldn't move. My mind raced with every fear, every scar left by the battles we had fought. But then I looked at him, really looked. Not the heir, not the millionaire, not the man his parents tried to mold. Just Dylan. The man who had sat in my cafe and listened. The man who had stood in the rain to hear me talk about my father. The man who had chosen me again and again, even when it cost him everything. Tears blurred my vision as I sank to the floor with him, my hands trembling as I touched the ring. "Yes," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Yes, Dylan. I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and the weight of it felt like both an anchor and a set of wings. He kissed me there on the kitchen floor, among the pots and pans and the scent of 1,000 meals, and for the first time in years, I felt not just hope but certainty. Weeks later, Harper's flame expanded into a second location, not because of investors or money, but because people believed in us, believed in the fire we had built together. And every night, when the doors closed and the lights dimmed, I looked at Dylan and realized that the fairy tale I had once thought impossible had not only found me, but made me stronger. My father had always said fire could burn or it could warm. With Dylan by my side, I finally understood what he meant. Our fire didn't destroy, it gave life. And together we would keep it burning forever.